Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. We must take September the 15th as the culminating date of the air battle. On this day, the Luftwaffe, after 2 heavy attacks on the 14th, made its greatest concentrated effort in a resumed daylight attack on London. It was one of the decisive battles of the war, and like the Battle of Waterloo, it was on a Sunday. I was at Chequers. I had already on several occasions visited the headquarters of No. 11 Fighter Group in order to witness the conduct of an air battle, when not much had happened. However, the weather on this day seemed suitable to the enemy, and accordingly I drove over to Uxbridge and arrived at the group headquarters. No. 11 Group comprised no fewer than 25 squadrons, covering the whole of Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire, and all the approaches across them to London. Air Vice Marshal Park had for 6 months commanded this group, on which our fate largely depended. From the beginning of Dunkirk, all the daylight actions in the south of England had already been conducted by him, and all its arrangements and apparatus had been brought to the highest perfection. My wife and I were taken down to the bomb-proof operations room 50 feet below ground. All the ascendancy of the Hurricanes and Spitfires would have been fruitless but for this system of underground control centers and telephone cables which had been devised and built before the war by the Air Ministry under Dowding's advice and impulse. Lasting credit is due to all concerned. In the south of England, there were at this time No. 11 Group headquarters and 6 subordinate fighter station centers. All these were, as has been described, under heavy stress. The supreme command was exercised from the fighter headquarters at Stanmore, but the actual handling of the direction of the squadrons was wisely left to No. 11 Group, which controlled the units through its fighter stations located in each county. The group operations room was like a small theater, about 60 feet across and with 2 stories. We took our seats in the dress circle. Below us was the large-scale map table, around which perhaps 20 highly trained young men and women with their telephone assistants were assembled. Opposite to us, covering the entire wall, where the theater curtain would be, was a gigantic blackboard divided into 6 columns with electric bulbs for the 6 fighter stations, each of their squadrons having a sub-column of its own, and also divided by lateral lines. Thus the lowest row of bulbs showed, as they were lighted, the squadrons which were standing by at 2 minutes' notice. The next row, those at readiness, 5 minutes. Then at available, 20 minutes. Then those which had taken off. The next row, those which had reported having seen the enemy. The next, with red lights, those which were in action. And the top row, those which were returning home. On the left-hand side, in a kind of glass stage box, were the 4 or 5 officers whose duty it was to weigh and measure the information received from our observer corps, which at this time numbered upwards of 50,000 men, women, and youths. Radar was still in its infancy, but it gave warning of raids approaching our coast, and the observers with field glasses and portable telephones were our main source of information about raiders flying over land. Thousands of messages were therefore received during an action. Several roomfuls of experienced people in other parts of the underground headquarters sifted them with great rapidity and transmitted the results from minute to minute directly to the plotters seated round the table on the floor and to the officer supervising from the glass stage box. On the right was another glass stage box containing army officers who reported the action of our anti-aircraft batteries, of which at this time in the command there were 200. At night, it was of vital importance to stop these batteries firing over certain areas in which our fighters would be closing with the enemy. I was not unacquainted with the general outlines of this system, having had it explained to me a year before the war by Dowding when I visited him at Stanmore. It had been shaped and refined in constant action, and all was now fused together into a most elaborate instrument of war, the like of which existed nowhere in the world. "I don't know," said Park as we went down, "whether anything will happen today. At present, all is quiet. However, after a quarter of an hour, the raid plotters began to move about. An attack of 40 plus was reported to be coming from the German stations in the Dieppe area. The bulbs along the bottom of the wall display panel began to glow as various squadrons came to stand by. Then in quick succession, 20 plus, 40 plus signals were received, and in another 10 minutes it was evident that a serious battle impended. On both sides the air began to fill. One after another signals came in, 40 plus, 60 plus, there was even an 80 plus. And on the floor table below us, the movement of all the waves of attack was marked by pushing discs forward from minute to minute along different lines of approach, while on the blackboard facing us, the rising lights showed our fighter squadrons getting into the air till there were only 4 or 5 left at readiness. These air battles, on which so much depended, lasted little more than an hour from the first encounter. The enemy had ample strength to send out new waves of attack, and our squadrons, having gone all out to gain the upper air, would have to refuel after 70 or 80 minutes, or land to rearm after a 5-minute engagement. If at this moment of refueling or rearming, the enemy were able to arrive with fresh, unchallenged squadrons, some of our fighters could be destroyed on the ground. It was therefore one of our principal objects to direct our squadrons so as not to have too many on the ground refueling or rearming simultaneously during daylight. Presently the red bulb showed that the majority of our squadrons were engaged. A subdued hum arose from the floor, where the busy plotters pushed their discs to and fro in accordance with the swiftly changing situation. The air marshal himself walked up and down behind, watching with vigilant eye every move in the game, supervising his junior executive hand, and only occasionally intervening with some decisive order, usually to reinforce a threatened area. In a little while, all our squadrons were fighting, and some had already begun to return to fuel. All were in the air. The lower line of bulbs was out. There was not one squadron left in reserve. At this moment, Park spoke to Dowding at Stanmore, asking for 3 squadrons from number 12 group to be put at his disposal in case of another major attack while his squadrons were rearming and refueling. This was done. They were specially needed to cover London and our fighter aerodromes because number 11 group had already shot their bolt. The young officer to whom this seemed a matter of routine continued to give his orders in accordance with the general directions of his group commander in a calm, low monotone. And the 3 reinforcing squadrons were soon absorbed. I became conscious of the anxiety of the commander, who now stood still behind his subordinate's chair. Hitherto I had watched in silence. I now asked, "What other reserves have we?" "There are none," said Air Vice Marshal Park. In an account which he wrote about it afterwards, he said that at this I looked grave. Well, I might. What losses should we not suffer if our refueling planes were caught on the ground by further raids of 40 plus or 50 plus? The odds were great, our margins small, the stakes infinite. Another 5 minutes passed and most of our squadrons had now descended to refuel. In many cases our resources could not give them overhead protection. Then it appeared that the enemy were going home. The shifting of the discs on the table below showed a continuous eastward movement of the German bombers and fighters. No new attack appeared. In another 10 minutes the action was ended. We climbed again the stairways which led to the surface, and almost as we emerged, the all clear sounded. "We are very glad, sir, you have seen this," said Park. Of course, during the last 20 minutes, we were so choked with information we couldn't handle it. This shows you the limitation of our present resources. They have been strained far beyond their limits today. I asked whether any results had come to hand, and remarked that the attack appeared to have been repelled satisfactorily. Park replied that he was not satisfied that we had intercepted as many raiders as he had hoped we should. It was evident that the enemy had everywhere pierced our defenses. Many scores of German bombers with their fighter escort had been reported over London. About a dozen had been brought down while I was below, but no picture of the results of the battle or of the damage or losses could be obtained. It was 4:30 p.m. before I got back to Chequers, and I immediately went to bed for my afternoon sleep. I must have been tired by the drama of number 11 group, for I did not wait till 8. When I rang, John Martin, my principal private secretary, came in with the evening budget of news from all over the world. It was repellent. This had gone wrong here. That had been delayed there. An unsatisfactory answer had been received from so-and-so. There had been bad sinkings in the Atlantic. However, said Martin, as he finished this account, all is redeemed by the air. We have shot down 183 for a loss of under 40. Although post-war information has shown that the enemy's losses on this day were only 56, September 15 was the crux of the Battle of Britain. That same night, our bomber command attacked in strength the shipping in the ports from Boulogne to Antwerp. At Antwerp, particularly heavy losses were inflicted. On September 17, as we now know, the Führer decided to postpone Seeland indefinitely, and September 15 may stand as the date of its demise.
It was the turning point. The Germans had not achieved their aim. Hitler, therefore, postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely, ordered his troops onto the defensive, and turned his attention eastwards. The battle, though, dragged on mainly in the form of German Lightning fighter raids until the end of October. It included 2 attacks by Italian aircraft. Mussolini wanted to display solidarity with his northern ally. These attacks proved disastrous for the Italians, with 13 of their small contingent of aircraft shot down on the second occasion. By now, though, the British were suffering even worse punishment. The German bombers had suffered too heavily by day and were concentrating their attacks during the hours of darkness, made even longer as winter drew on. Night after night, German bombers pounded British cities. London was attacked every single night bar one up to the 12th of November. The siren sound that Londoners had heard in daylight from time to time during August was now to become part of the daily and nightly life of every child, woman, and man in the capital. For more than 100 consecutive nights, along with the drone of enemy bombers, anti-aircraft fire, and the whistle and crunch of high explosive bombs dropped in their thousands. For the Luftwaffe, there was no pretense of striking only military targets. To their surprise and the surprise of neutral nations, sometimes the surprise of Londoners themselves, they steeled themselves to it. The ARP air raid precaution wardens stayed at their posts. Doctors and nurses worked on throughout the raids. Rescue squads carried out their often gruesome tasks night and day. The bombs fell indiscriminately on hundreds of thousands of homes. They fell on shops, on hospitals, on churches. Even after the all clear, no period of even momentary safety was guaranteed. For the Nazis also dropped tons of delayed action bombs which might explode days later, concealed under cover of unmoved rubble, and through which rescue services searched for trapped citizens. Day and night, the fire service battled with countless fires.
Hostile raids, sir.
The Nazi military policy now was the destruction of the capital, mostly at night. The RAF couldn't be of much help at night. It all rested on the efficiency of searchlights and the accuracy of anti-air fire.
Harvey?
Hello, Jack.
Sound happy enough down there tonight, don't they?
Yes, they're all right.
The German bombers at first concentrated particularly on London's docklands and left the East End districts a roaring inferno. But still the citizens stood up to it night after night. They burrowed underground, wondering whether they would find their home still standing in the morning. Morning after morning, they emerged into the dawn to find out the answer. The Battle of Britain for these months had now become the Battle of London. In spite of the bombs, the fires, the personal suffering and losses, they got to their desks, to their workbenches, to spend another 10 hours, 12 or more, working, working, working. There were times when they wondered whether they would endure much more. But some things gave them hope. Britain was starting to retaliate.
The submarine yards there. There's a very good one taking on the night one here. Oh, that's That's it. There's the submarine yard. There. Rochester, this is your target for tonight. The submarine and shipbuilding yards at Bremen. It's a vitally important target.
British bombers were taking the fight back to Germany. This time with bomb loads, not the propaganda leaflets they had dropped over 1 year before.
Hello, rear gunner. Can you hear me?
I'm okay, Skipper.
Hello, operator. Everything okay?
Well, it seems to be all here, sir.
Goering had promised the German people that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb a German city, but the people of Bremen, and later on the cities of the Ruhr, had good reason not to take his promises seriously.
Stand by. I'm going in a glide.
Steady! I got the bullseye with the last one.
Hitler proclaimed the RAF as night gangsters, and for their crime, he would react on British cities a thousand-fold revenge. The first target was to be the city of Coventry. On the night of the 14th of November, 1 million pounds of bombs were hurled on the city and gave the English language a new word. The city was Coventраted. Between dusk that night and the following dawn, it was bombed flatter and more heavily than Rotterdam or Warsaw.
The King has been to see how the people of Coventry were carrying on after their terrible ordeal. Not only did he find that their spirit was magnificent and that everything possible was being done to alleviate suffering, but it was also quite evident that his 5-hour tour, accompanied by Mr. Herbert Morrison, had greatly encouraged them. This was the cathedral. The city, having been mercilessly bombed throughout a whole night without regard to military targets, now presents a grim appearance of devastation. The cathedral's spire and the font remain. The rest is rubble. But all that the cathedral represented and the spirit of this centuries-old city lives on. The city of Coventry mourned its air raid victims when nearly 1,000 people attended the first funeral service. 172 of Coventry's dead were being buried in a common grave, yet even while the last rites were being performed, an air battle was taking place high above the cemetery. Even while Coventry mourned her dead, the Nazi came to renew his terror. In in one common bond of sympathy and resolution, the whole country will carry on the fight till Nazism is destroyed forever.
The incessant raids on Britain by the Luftwaffe devastated the infrastructure of cities, towns, ports, and manufacturing bases, not to mention countless lives. But what they failed to destroy was the morale and the spirit of the British people. The Blitz was failing for 4 reasons. One being the heroism of the RAF, the second being the fact that the local authorities all had well-organized and well-trained civil defense and rescue systems in operation. There was a total chain of command with well-tried equipment in each city and district. The third reason was the fact that the Luftwaffe had used scatter bombs over most of the targets. Thus, by spreading the damage and loss, this strategy tended to equalize and broaden the suffering throughout the community, who were, as a result, more closely linked together in their determination to resist. The fourth reason is a culmination of the other 3. A well-trained and organized population, enormously encouraged and heartened by the RAF, infuriated and hardened by suffering, and daily visited by its leaders, from the King and Churchill, adjusted itself to the bombing situation with extraordinary calm and courage. Wardens, firemen, rescue workers, salvage teams, repair gangs, bomb disposal squads, ambulance drivers, doctors, nurses, factory workers, and housewives all were working together, cheating the Luftwaffe of its victory. With water pipes fractured and supplies short, they queued in an orderly manner, patiently waiting to fill their buckets. There was a complete air of calm, and for most, life was simply a routine of making do as best they could. Neighbors would work alongside each other, salvaging what few possessions were left after a night's raid. The daily array of ARP wardens, police, firemen, passing volunteers and servicemen, frantically digging, often with bare hands, amid the chaos of disintegrating buildings to rescue survivors, their pets and belongings, became, in every sense, dreadfully familiar. The Luftwaffe flew over 12,000 night sorties during this period of the Blitz, and the terror which the people had to face was daunting and dreadful. Threatened so starkly from the sky, the people soon began to live like moles, scurrying underground into the safety of the shelters every night, only to emerge next morning to yet another scene of devastation. For London, September the 7th, 1940, marked the first day of the terrible months to come. Of over 100 consecutive nights of aerial bombardment. As the nightly raids went on, through the autumn into the winter, the terror and horror became more and more familiar. Many people simply went about their business, not even bothering to go down to the shelters at night. This was Britain in its darkest hour. Winston Churchill, in his dogged resolve to keep the nation's spirits high, would visit almost daily one or more of the badly damaged areas. On the morning of the 14th of November, Churchill was on his way to his Oxford country home, having been to Neville Chamberlain's funeral, who had died 3 days previously. He was alerted to the fact that a big raid was imminent for that night. He immediately asked his driver to turn around and take him back to London. He was not going to spend the night peacefully, he told his private secretary, while the people of London were under heavy attack. The target for that night was not, in fact, London. It was Coventry. Because of the relatively small size of Coventry, the shock of the raid was that much stronger. But although the damage caused was immense, the Germans had once again made a strategic mistake. For if they had wanted to destroy Coventry completely, which was their plan, they should have returned again the next night. But they did not. Thus, the city's vital war industry was able to recover. In the first half of September, 2,000 civilians were killed and about 8,000 wounded. 80% of the casualties being in London. From then on, the toll rose steadily. In the third week of September, 1,500 civilians had been killed, 1,200 of them in London. By the end of the month, the toll had risen to almost 7,000 dead. In the months of October and November, this toll rose dramatically higher still. Yet still, the spirit of the people wasn't broken. With merchant shipping losses still running high in the Atlantic, the British people were subjected to further hardships when strict food rationing was introduced. This also covered other essentials like clothes. The attacks from the air also made it seem as though the whole British infrastructure was being destroyed. Seemingly isolated, there appeared to be little to stop bruised and battered Britain from going under. The Luftwaffe's blitz on Britain during the grim autumn and winter of 1940-41 had been watched with awe by neutral states. Neutral observers marveled at the way that the country was absorbing such terrible punishment, but many doubted that Britain could hold on indefinitely. Nowhere was the battle watched with more concern than in the United States of America. The most significant of the neutrals and the one most closely bound to Britain through a common language and the antecedents of many of her citizens. Churchill knew full well that if Hitler was to be beaten, Britain would need the help of the United States. Many Americans, as they had done in World War I, did actually volunteer to fight for the British. 7 U.S. pilots fought in the Battle of Britain. They helped to form the RAF's Eagle Squadron. It was, however, the resilience and bravery of the British people which began to catch the American imagination. In particular, it was the broadcasts by the CBS London correspondent Ed Murrow on the Blitz which increased public sympathy.
I remember the evening of Sunday, December 29th. It was just like any other winter evening. The first bombers were over London at about 6:30. Soon the fires hissed from the top-story windows. Hitler once boasted, "I will rub out their cities." This is what he meant.
In the November 1940 presidential election, Wendell Willkie's strict isolationist policy lost out to Roosevelt. Roosevelt spoke to the American people at the end of the year on the 4 essential freedoms at stake: of speech and religion, and from want and fear.
They do not need manpower, but they do need billions of dollars worth of the weapons of defense.
The almost total destruction of Coventry and other cities, such as Plymouth, brought the war not a second nearer to its end for the Germans. On the contrary, the people returned after each raid to their lathes and machines, for they knew that the workbench and the assembly line was as deadly a weapon as the gun. For 109 consecutive nights, one part of London or another was savagely bombed. But unexpectedly, one night, the citizens had their first night off. December the 25th, 1940. In the days to come, the citizens became aware that the raids were becoming shorter and fewer. By the spring, it seemed at last that it was finally over. In January 1941, Roosevelt had introduced his Lend-Lease Bill. Churchill's prayers were being answered. America would supply war materials, which would be paid for in kind after the war.
For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back through creeks and inlets making, comes silent flooding in the main, and not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward, look, the land is bright.
Bomber Command was by now increasing its attacks on Germany. As well as using the Wellingtons, they were also introducing new types of much heavier four-engined bombers.
What tragedies, what horrors, what crimes has Hitler and all that Hitler stands for brought upon Europe and the world. The ruins of Warsaw, of Rotterdam, of Belgrade, are monuments which will long recall to future generations the outrage of the unopposed air bombing applied with calculated and scientific cruelty to helpless populations. Here in London and throughout the cities of our island, and in Ireland, there may also be seen the marks of devastation. They are being repaid, and presently they will be more than repaid.
The German population was now experiencing for the first time what it felt like to be blitzed. These attacks enraged Hitler, who threatened to obliterate Britain's cities in retaliation.
Meine sehr geehrten, Sie werden bei uns Städte im großen Ausmaß angreifen. Wir werden Ihre Städte ausradieren.
The air attacks on Britain continued into May 1941. By now, Hitler had turned his full attention to the east. Even so, the Blitz did not end with a whimper. The last raid, on the night of the 10th and 11th of May, was against London. Out of the blue, the Blitz returned with doubled fury. For many people it seemed worse than anything that had gone before, as millions of firebombs rained down on the capital. Matter of minutes, more than 1,500 different sections of the city burst into roaring flames, flames that merged together in what was the greatest fire since the Great Fire of London, almost 300 years before. In the midst of all the fires and destruction, Vital water mains were shattered and water pressure almost entirely cut off. The men of the London Fire Brigade and their auxiliaries were the heroes of that night, as they had been at the height of the Blitz some months before. They stretched temporary hose lines out to the center of the Thames through mud and slime. Ironically, that night the river had one of its lowest tides for years. Below ground in the tube stations and shelters, the people of London felt they were back where they had been 4 months ago. It seemed that they were to have to endure it all over again. But next day, to everyone's amazement, there was no siren, no air raid warning, no attack. They didn't know it then, but Hitler had turned away from Britain to undertake the conquest of Russia. The Battle of Britain had finally been won, but not by Hitler. For the first time, the Germans had tasted defeat. For almost a year, they had struck Britain with their formidable might. They had killed over 40,000 British people. But from the start, not one single Nazi soldier set foot as an invader upon the soil of mainland Britain. The Battle of Britain and the people who won it also won for the world a year of precious time. Time in which to prepare for final victory.
Churchill, the Prime Minister. In September last, ladies and gentlemen, having been defeated in his invasion plans by the Royal Air Force, Hitler declared his intention to raze the cities of Britain to the ground. And in the early days of that month, he set the whole fury of the Huns upon London. The staunchness and vigor of London was fully matched by the splendid behavior of our ports and cities when they in turn received the full violence of the enemy's assault. We have to ask ourselves this question. Will the bombing attacks of last autumn and winter come back again? Mr. Chairman, we are proceeding on the assumption that they will. And if the lull is to end, if the storm is to renew itself, London will be ready. London will not flinch. London can take it again. We ask no favors of the enemy. We seek from them no compunction. On the contrary, if tonight the people of London were asked to cast their votes as to whether a convention should be entered into to stop the bombing of all cities, An overwhelming majority would cry, no, we will mete out to the Germans the measure, and more than the measure, they have meted out to us. We will have no truce or parley with you or the grisly gang who work your wicked will. You do your worst, and we will do our best.